August 24th, 2012. Leicester, England. The air is thick not with the metallic tang of blood and the roar of cannons, but with the mundane fumes of traffic and the low hum of a city at work. The scene of the crime, the final act of a medieval tragedy, is a social services car park, a bland patch of asphalt marked with white lines. There is no grandeur here, only the damp, cloying smell of disturbed earth mingling with the scent of rain on tarmac. A mechanical digger groans, its steel bucket scraping away layers of soil, time, and forgetting. Then, a shout. Work stops. The soundscape shrinks to the hushed whispers of the archaeological team and the gentle whisk of brushes on soil. A human leg bone emerges from the dark, damp earth. Then another. Then a spine, not straight and true, but bent into a severe, unnatural curve. This is not the grand tomb of a revered monarch, but the hasty, ignominious pit dug for a vanquished enemy. The sensory assault is one of shocking anticlimax. The cold, clinical reality of forensic science meeting the hot-blooded myth of a legendary tyrant. They have found him. Under layers of gravel and Victorian rubble, in the sacred ground of a long-demolished friary, lies the body of Richard III, the last Plantagenet King of England, lost for over 500 years. The discovery is a seismic shock, a moment where the tangible, brittle reality of bone confronts the colossal, monstrous edifice of literary legend. The twisted spine in the dirt is the first, most profound piece of physical evidence in a 500-year-old cold case, a silent testament that forces a question that had been relegated to the fringes of history into the global spotlight. If the foundational detail of the monster, the twisted body, was real, what else about his dark saga might be true, and what might be the greatest lie ever told? This is the narrative of him, Richard, the last king of the House of York, a man whose name has become a synonym for tyranny, a shorthand for the monstrous ambition that consumes all decency. His story, as it has been told, is a morality play written in blood, a cautionary tale of a fiend who murdered his own nephews, the little princes in the tower, to seize a crown that was never his. This is the saga of the Shakespearean villain, the poisonous bunch-backed toad, a creature so physically and morally deformed that he stands as one of history's great antagonists. Yet, the unearthing of his body from its pathetic grave forces us to confront the central dramatic paradox of his existence. How did a man praised in his own lifetime by his own people, especially in the north of England, where he ruled, as a just administrator, a pious man, and a loyal warrior, become this icon of pure evil almost overnight? Why was this king, who fought and died under the banner of the White Rose, so utterly and comprehensively hated for half a millennium, only to now, in our time, be the subject of a powerful and passionate movement of vindication? The core question is not simply, did he do it? The question is not just about the fate of two boys in a stone tower. The deeper, more unsettling question is about the very nature of history itself. We must ask, was Richard III truly the killer of princes, a monster who deserved his fate? Or was he the first and greatest victim of a calculated, brilliant, and terrifyingly successful propaganda campaign, a political assassination so complete that it not only killed the man, but murdered his reputation for all time, leaving behind a caricature that served the agenda of his enemies? To understand this man, we must return to the world that spawned him, a world drenched in blood and defined by the question of who had the right to rule. To understand Richard, we must first feel the penetrating chill of 15th century England, a kingdom not of chivalry and romance, but of trauma, paranoia, and existential exhaustion. This was a nation tearing itself apart from the inside. The great powers of continental Europe, like France and Burgundy, were coalescing into centralized states, their monarchies forging national identities. But England was moving backward, spiraling into a vortex of dynastic civil war known as the Wars of the Roses. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension and the smell of old blood. For more than 30 years, the two rival branches of the Plantagenet dynasty, the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and the House of York, symbolized by the white, had waged a savage and deeply personal war for the throne. This was not a conflict of nations, but of cousins. The lines of battle were drawn not at borders, but through villages, towns, and even families. The geopolitical chessboard was slick with English blood, a spectacle of self-destruction that left the kingdom dangerously vulnerable. Across the Channel, King Louis XI of France, the universal spider, watched with cold amusement, spinning his webs of intrigue, playing one English faction against the other, ensuring his nation's historic rival remained weak and divided. The very concept of stability was a distant memory. Generations had been born and had died, knowing nothing but war, the sudden reversal of fortune, the executioner's axe. A king one day could be a fugitive the next. To the common man, the war was a relentless scourge, a source of crippling taxes, plundered fields, and the constant threat of being levied into an army to fight for a nobleman whose claim to the throne was an abstraction written on a distant parchment. This was the forge Richard was born into, a world where loyalty was a commodity, survival was a daily struggle, and the crown was not a sacred trust, but the ultimate prize in a brutal winner-take-all game. Into this world of chaos and carnage, Richard Plantagenet was born in 1452, the 11th child of Richard, Duke of York. His origin was not merely a detail of birth, it was an inheritance of blood and vengeance, a veritable ancestral curse. His father was the man who ignited the Wars of the Roses by challenging the weak and mentally unstable Lancastrian King Henry VI. This act defined the singular, obsessive mission of the House of York: to reclaim a crown they believed had been stolen from them generations prior. Richard's earliest memories were not of a peaceful nursery, but of the visceral shock of catastrophe. When he was just 8 years old, his father and his older brother Edmund were defeated at the Battle of Wakefield. Their heads cut off, adorned with paper crowns, and impaled on the Micklegate Bar, the main gate of the city of York. This was a sensory assault of unimaginable horror for a young boy, the public, ritualistic humiliation of his family's honor, a message of extermination delivered in the most brutal possible terms. This event was the crucible that forged his character. Fleeing into exile with his mother, he learned his first, most vital lesson. To lose in this game was not just to be defeated, but to be erased, your family name spat upon, your very body desecrated. His salvation and his entire worldview would be shaped by his older brother, Edward, a military prodigy who, against all odds, crushed the Lancastrian forces, avenged their father, and seized the throne to become King Edward IV. Richard grew up in the shadow of this charismatic, powerful 6'4" warrior king, and from this upbringing, a second, equally powerful trait was forged: an intense, almost fanatical loyalty to his brother and the Yorkist cause. He was not the heir. He was the spare, the supporter, the enforcer. His youth was not one of entitled luxury, but of hard-bitten military campaigns and the cold, practical business of securing a throne that rested on a foundation of blood and bone. This upbringing created a man who was deeply pious, fiercely loyal, and utterly ruthless when he perceived a threat to his family and his house. Richard's first true steps into the great game of English politics were not as a schemer in shadowy corridors, but as a warrior and administrator in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of northern England. After his brother Edward IV secured the throne, he made Richard the Duke of Gloucester and granted him vast estates in the north, a region historically rebellious and fiercely independent. This was a test, a charge to tame a difficult frontier, and it was a task Richard embraced with a vigor that would define his public reputation for nearly 2 decades. To understand the paradox of Richard, one must first understand the man the Northerners knew. They did not see a twisted plotter. They saw a lord who delivered something they craved more than anything: justice and order. He established the Council of the North, a legal body that provided swift, affordable justice for the common man, bypassing the corrupt and often inaccessible courts in distant London. He was a visible and active ruler, not an absentee landlord. Chroniclers of the era, even those not entirely friendly to him, noted his piety, his legislative acumen, and his military prowess. He commanded England's armies against the Scots with skill and success, earning the respect of the hardened soldiers and border lords. This was Richard, the loyal brother, the strong hand of the king, the shield of the realm. He cultivated an image of incorruptibility, a stark contrast to the perceived greed and decadence of the southern court, particularly the rapacious family of the Queen. He was seen as the quintessential medieval nobleman, brave in battle, just in peace, and devout in faith. This period is the bedrock of the Ricardian defense. For nearly 20 years, he did nothing to suggest the monstrous ambition that would later define him. He was the pillar of his brother's regime, the man who held the most dangerous part of the kingdom in a state of relative peace through sheer force of will and competent governance. This long, unblemished record of service is the first great inconvenient fact for his accusers, the first clue that the man and the monster might not be one and the same. It begs the question: what could possibly transform this paragon of loyalty into a usurper and a murderer? To find the answer, we must dig deeper than his public actions and uncover the inner demon that haunted the House of York, a hidden motivation that was as much a part of his inheritance as his royal blood. A profound, almost paranoid obsession with the concept of legitimacy. This was not mere political theory. It was the ghost at every feast, the whisper in every council chamber. The entire Yorkist claim to the throne was based on the argument that the Lancastrian dynasty, which had ruled for 3 generations, was itself illegitimate, the result of a usurpation that had occurred back in 1399. Richard's father had died for this belief, his head rotting on a spike as a public refutation of his claim. For Richard and his brother Edward, their right to rule was not just a matter of power, but of divine sanction, a correction of a historical crime. This belief system was their core identity. Any perceived threat to the purity and legitimacy of their bloodline was therefore not just a political problem, but an existential and even a theological crisis. This inner demon explains the almost pathological ruthlessness they could display when their claim was challenged. It explains why Edward IV, upon gaining the throne, executed not only the Lancastrian king but also his son, extinguishing their line. It explains the execution of their own brother, George, Duke of Clarence, for treason. For the Yorks, there could be no compromise with those who questioned their right. This obsession was the psychological flaw, the hairline crack in Richard's loyal armor. He had spent his entire life fighting for the legitimacy of his brother's crown and his brother's sons. But if he were ever to believe, or be convinced, that that legitimacy was itself a sham, his entire worldview, built on a foundation of unwavering loyalty, could shatter in an instant. This deep-seated fear, this ancestral curse, was the dormant volcano within him. All it needed was the right catalyst, the right political crisis, to erupt with devastating and kingdom-altering force. The catalyst for this eruption arrived not on a battlefield, but in the king's bedchamber, in the form of a woman whose beauty was matched only by the ambition of her family. The fateful encounter that would ultimately seal Richard's destiny was his brother Edward's shocking marriage to Elizabeth Woodville in 1464. To the English nobility, this was a catastrophe. Edward, the charismatic Yorkist king, was expected to make a powerful European match to secure his new dynasty. Instead, he secretly married a commoner, a widow of a Lancastrian knight, with a swarm of hungry relatives. Elizabeth Woodville was the living embodiment of everything the old, proud nobility, including Richard, despised. She was a parvenu, and she and her family, the Woodvilles, descended upon the court like a flock of vultures. They were granted titles, lands, and lucrative marriages with a speed that was breathtaking and deeply offensive to the established order. A palpable sense of revulsion filled the air at court. The Woodvilles were seen as greedy, arrogant, and dangerously influential over the king. Richard, as Duke of Gloucester, stood apart from this. He was a man of the old school, a prince of the blood who saw the Woodville ascendancy not just as a personal slight, but as a grave danger to the stability of the Yorkist regime. He saw them as a faction that was isolating the king from his natural allies, the very men who had helped him win the throne. The tension between Richard and the Queen's family was the central political drama of Edward's reign. It was a cold war fought in whispers and sideways glances, a struggle for influence over the king. This was not a simple rivalry. It was a clash of worldviews. Richard represented the traditional feudal power of the great magnates, while the Woodvilles represented a new, more fluid court based on royal favor. As long as King Edward lived, his immense authority and personal charm kept this animosity in check. But the moment he was gone, this simmering resentment was destined to boil over into open, savage conflict, with the fate of the king's young sons as the prize. The moment of crisis arrived with the shocking suddenness of a heart attack. On the 9th of April, 1483, King Edward IV, the giant charismatic son around whom the entire Yorkist world revolved, died unexpectedly at the age of 40. A profound sensory shock rippled through the kingdom. The air itself, once filled with the certainty of his rule, was now thick with fear and the stench of political decay. Edward's heir was his 12-year-old son, now Edward V, who was in the custody of his mother's family, the Woodvilles. For Richard, miles away in the north, this was the nightmare scenario. He knew with chilling certainty that if the Woodvilles secured control of the boy king, they would rule in his name, and their first act would be to destroy their enemies, chief among them Richard himself. It was a moment of pure Darwinian political survival. Acting with the speed and decisiveness he had learned on the battlefield, Richard executed a stunning gambit. He rode south, intercepted the young king's party at Stony Stratford, and arrested the boy's uncle, Anthony Woodville, and his half-brother, Richard Grey. This was the price of power, the first taste of the ruthlessness that would come to define him. It was a clinical, bloodless coup d'etat. He assured the young king he was acting only to protect him from his manipulative relatives, but everyone understood the brutal reality. The loyal duke had become the Lord Protector, the supreme power in the land. But this first act of aggression, this first shedding of blood, for the arrested Woodvilles were soon executed without trial, was a Rubicon. He had seized power to, in his mind, protect the Yorkist state and himself from a hostile faction. But in doing so, he had demonstrated a shocking capacity for extra-legal action. The mask of the loyal servant had slipped, revealing the face of a man willing to do whatever it took to secure control. The kingdom held its breath, wondering what this formidable, enigmatic man would do next. While Richard consolidated his power in London, a shadow began to lengthen across the English Channel. An antagonist on the macro level who represented the ghosts of the past and the threat of the future. This was Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, a man who, by all rights, should have been a minor footnote in history. He was the last significant claimant of the defeated House of Lancaster, living in exile in Brittany. His claim to the throne was laughably weak, derived through his mother from an illegitimate line. He had spent his entire adult life as a fugitive, a pawn in the games of European diplomacy. He had no personal experience of England, no great army, no vast fortune. But he possessed two things that made him infinitely dangerous: an unshakable belief in his own destiny and the backing of England's enemies. For King Louis XI of France, and later his successor, Henry Tudor was the perfect weapon. He was a permanent source of instability that could be unleashed upon England at any moment, a living threat to the Yorkist dynasty. While Richard was focused on the internal enemy, the Woodvilles, this external threat was quietly gathering strength. Henry became a magnet for all the disaffected and the desperate, the Lancastrian exiles who dreamed of returning home, and the disgruntled Yorkists who felt marginalized by the new regime. He represented a simple, powerful alternative to the bloody infighting of the Yorkist court. The existence of Henry Tudor fundamentally altered Richard's political calculations. It meant that any action Richard took, any perceived weakness or division in the Yorkist camp, would be an invitation for invasion. This constant, looming threat from across the water created a pressure cooker environment in London, forcing Richard to act with a speed and severity that might have been unnecessary in peacetime. He was not just fighting for control of the government. He was fighting for the survival of his dynasty against an enemy who had nothing to lose and a continent of allies to gain. Now came the fatal mistake, the central act of the drama from which Richard's reputation would never recover. After seizing control as Lord Protector, Richard had the two young sons of his brother, King Edward V, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, housed in the Tower of London. At first, this was a logical step, a standard procedure to secure the royal heirs in a fortress palace ahead of the coronation. The Tower was not yet the grim prison of popular imagination. It was a royal residence, a seat of power. But as the weeks of the Protectorate dragged on, the nature of their confinement seemed to change. The boys were seen less and less frequently playing in the Tower gardens. Their attendants were dismissed, their access to the outside world curtailed. Then, sometime in the summer of 1483, they vanished entirely. A profound and chilling silence descended. There was no announcement of their death, no public funeral, no official explanation. They simply ceased to be. This act, or rather this lack of an act, created a black hole at the very heart of Richard's nascent regime. The sensory experience was not one of violent screams or visible blood, but of an unnerving, creeping dread. The disappearance of the princes was a void, and into that void, the darkest possible suspicions began to grow. Did they die of illness? Were they spirited away to safety? Or were they murdered in their beds, their small bodies buried in secret? The lack of evidence became, paradoxically, the most damning evidence of all. It was a catastrophic political miscalculation. By failing to produce the boys, dead or alive, Richard allowed rumor to become fact. The image of the loving uncle and loyal protector was irrevocably shattered, replaced by the chilling specter of a ruthless tyrant willing to murder innocent children to secure his own path to the throne. This was the fatal mistake, a psychological breaking point for the kingdom, and a stain so deep it could never be washed away. Richard now stood at a precipice. The kingdom was in a state of high tension. The Woodville faction was neutralized but resentful, and the disappearance of the princes had created a crisis of legitimacy for his protectorate. It was in this moment of supreme chaos that he made his most audacious move, using the very instability he had helped create as his opportunity. He and his key ally, the Duke of Buckingham, launched a stunning political blitzkrieg. The justification they needed was provided by a priest, Ralph Shaw, who delivered a sermon at St. Paul's Cross, the public heart of London's information network. The sermon's content was political dynamite. Shaw declared that Richard's own brother, the late King Edward IV, had been pre-contracted to marry another woman before he secretly wed Elizabeth Woodville. According to the canon law of the day, this rendered his marriage to Woodville invalid and all of their children, including the 2 boys in the Tower, illegitimate bastards with no claim to the throne. The air crackled with the shock of this revelation. The argument was legally dubious, but politically brilliant. It retroactively justified everything Richard had done. It transformed his coup against the Woodvilles from a power grab into a righteous act to save the kingdom from a false lineage. It provided a neat, if convenient, explanation for setting aside Edward V. With the princes declared illegitimate, the line of succession fell to the next legitimate Yorkist heir, Richard, Duke of Gloucester himself. A carefully orchestrated piece of political theater followed. A delegation of lords and London citizens formally offered Richard the crown, begging him to take the throne to avoid a succession crisis. After a show of pious reluctance, Richard accepted. In a matter of weeks, he had transformed himself from Lord Protector to King Richard III. He had used the chaos of his brother's death and the mystery of his nephew's disappearance to seize the ultimate prize, an act of breathtaking ambition that confirmed the worst fears of his enemies and set him on a collision course with destiny. The 26th of June, 1483. The Great Hall of Westminster Abbey is a symphony of sensory overload, a deliberate spectacle designed to awe the kingdom into submission. The scent of incense, thick and cloying, mingles with the smell of beeswax from thousands of candles, their light glinting off a sea of polished armor, shimmering silks, and priceless jewels worn by the assembled nobility. The sound is a low, reverent hum, punctuated by the soaring Latin chants of the choir and the solemn pronouncements of the Archbishop of Canterbury. At the center of it all stands Richard. This is his greatest triumph. He feels the immense weight of St. Edward's crown being lowered onto his head. The cold, heavy gold, a tangible symbol of the power he has just seized. He is anointed with holy oil, its cool touch on his skin a confirmation of divine sanction. In this moment, he is no longer the Duke of Gloucester, the Lord Protector, the alleged usurper. He is Richard, by the grace of God, King of England and France and Lord of Ireland. The ceremony is a masterpiece of political stagecraft, designed to project legitimacy and permanence. His beloved wife, Anne Neville is crowned queen beside him. His son, Edward of Middleham, is invested as Prince of Wales. This is the foundation of a new dynasty. For a brief, shining moment, he has achieved everything. He has defeated the Woodville faction, averted what he saw as a disastrous minority rule, and secured the throne in the name of what he believed to be the true, legitimate Yorkist line. The acclamation of the crowd, carefully managed but powerful nonetheless, rings in his ears. He holds the orb and scepter, the ancient symbols of royal authority, and looks out upon the faces of his court. He has stared into the abyss of political chaos and emerged as a king. The triumph is total, but the very air in the abbey is thick with unspoken questions, with the ghosts of the two boys who should have been at the heart of this ceremony. The splendor of the coronation cannot entirely mask the dark and unsettling path he took to get there. To understand Richard's reign, we must attempt the impossible: to look inside the mind of the man at the moment of his triumph, to understand the psychology of the pious usurper. As Richard sat on the throne, he did not see himself as the monster his enemies would later paint. In his own mind, his actions were not driven by naked ambition, but by a painful, necessary duty. He saw himself as a reformer, a man chosen by God to cleanse a corrupt court and restore justice to a fractured kingdom. This conviction is crucial. He likely believed the story he had promoted, that his brother's sons were illegitimate, and that he was the only man who could prevent the kingdom from sliding back into the bloody chaos of civil war under the weak and factional rule of the Woodvilles. His hubris was not that of a simple tyrant, but of a man convinced of his own righteousness, and his first acts as king seemed to bear this out. Almost immediately, he embarked on a royal progress through his kingdom, not to intimidate, but to be seen and to dispense justice. He sat in local courts, heard the petitions of the poor, and earned a reputation for being accessible and fair. More importantly, in his one and only parliament in 1484, he initiated a remarkable series of legislative reforms. He outlawed the practice of benevolences, forced loans extorted from the wealthy by the crown. He passed laws to protect English merchants from foreign competition, reformed the jury system, and most significantly, established the principle of bail, preventing the rich and powerful from having their enemies locked up indefinitely on trumped-up charges. This was the work of a sophisticated and forward-thinking legislator, not a blood-soaked despot. This is the central paradox of his reign. The man who took the throne through an act of brutal illegality then proceeded to govern with a surprising degree of legality and concern for the common good. He was a man at war with himself, a king whose enlightened policies were forever overshadowed by the dark cloud of his accession. The ink on the coronation oaths was barely dry when Richard's triumph was shattered by a betrayal so swift and shocking it struck at the very heart of his new regime. The sworn enemy who emerged was not a Lancastrian holdout or a Woodville loyalist, but his own right-hand man, his chief collaborator, his kingmaker. Henry Stafford, the second Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham was one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in England, a man whose vast network of estates and retainers had been indispensable in Richard's seizure of power. He had stood beside Richard at every step, publicly denouncing the legitimacy of Edward's children and urging Richard to take the crown. Richard had rewarded him lavishly, making him Constable of England and granting him enormous power, particularly in Wales. Their alliance seemed unbreakable, a partnership of wolves who had hunted together. Then, in the autumn of 1483, Buckingham inexplicably turned. the man who had helped Richard lock the princes in the Tower, suddenly raised the banner of rebellion, declaring his support for the exiled Henry Tudor. The chemistry of this betrayal is one of the great mysteries of the period. What was his motivation? Was he overcome with remorse for the fate of the princes, as he later claimed? Or was it a case of pure, calculated ambition? Buckingham himself had a distant, diluted claim to the throne, and perhaps he saw Richard as a temporary placeholder, a usurper he could easily depose to claim the prize for himself. Whatever the reason, the rebellion was a catastrophe for Richard. It lent immense credibility to the rumors about the princes, as Buckingham's defection was seen as proof of Richard's guilt. It shattered the illusion of unity in the Yorkist camp and demonstrated to Henry Tudor that Richard's support was a house of cards. Though the rebellion itself was a dismal failure, plagued by bad weather and poor coordination, and ending with Buckingham's capture and swift execution, the psychological damage was immense. The kingmaker's betrayal proved that Richard could trust no one. His reign, born in a coup, would now have to be sustained by constant vigilance against enemies lurking not just abroad, but within his own inner circle. While the high drama of rebellion and betrayal dominated the political narrative, Richard's brief reign was also a period of significant and surprisingly progressive construction, a flurry of legislative activity that provides a powerful counter-narrative to the Tudor myth. To understand the man, one must look not only at the crown he stole, but at what he did with it. The laws passed in his only parliament of January 1484 are a testament to a mind deeply concerned with justice and the mechanics of good governance. This is the mid-level zoom, the policy details that reveal the character of the ruler. The most celebrated of these was the abolition of benevolences, the arbitrary and deeply resented system of forced gifts from wealthy subjects to the crown. This act alone earned him immense goodwill among the merchant classes. But his reforms went deeper. He created the College of Arms, standardizing heraldry. He established a primitive form of legal aid, and most remarkably, he introduced the concept of bail, ensuring that a person's property could not be seized before their conviction, and that they could not be imprisoned indefinitely without due process. These were not the actions of a tyrant seeking to consolidate absolute power, but of a king strengthening the rights of his subjects under the law. Furthermore, he continued his work from his time as Duke of Gloucester, reinforcing the power and prestige of the Council of the North, ensuring that this remote and often neglected part of his kingdom had efficient access to justice. These good laws stand in stark, almost schizophrenic contrast to the alleged evil of their creator. For the Ricardian apologist, this is Exhibit A, the evidence of a man who, had he been given time, might have become one of England's great law-giving kings. For the traditionalist, it is merely the cynical maneuvering of a usurper, a desperate attempt to buy popularity and legitimize a stolen throne. But the laws themselves remain on the statute books, a silent, inconvenient testament to the complexity of a man who was simultaneously a breaker and a maker of laws. To fully grasp the pressures closing in on the king, we must zoom in from the macro level of politics and law to the intimate personal tragedies that defined his final years. These are the onions and vegetables, the deeply human details that give the epic saga its flavor of authentic pain. Richard's marriage to Anne Neville, the daughter of the infamous kingmaker Earl of Warwick, was a complex affair born of political necessity, but by all accounts, it had grown into a union of genuine affection and partnership. She was his queen, crowned beside him, a living symbol of the unity of the great Yorkist and Neville houses. But their life together was stalked by sorrow. Their only child, Edward of Middleham, Prince of Wales, was a frail and sickly boy. In April of 1484, just as Richard's Parliament of Reforms was concluding, the news arrived like a death knell from Middleham Castle. The young prince was dead. The blow was utterly devastating. A contemporary chronicler from the monastery of Croyland wrote that upon hearing the news, the king and queen were nearly driven mad with grief, their public agony a shocking sight for the court. This was more than just a personal tragedy. It was a dynastic catastrophe. With his son's death, Richard's line was extinguished. He had no heir. The future of the House of York, the cause for which he had sacrificed everything, now rested on his own survival. Less than a year later, in March of 1485, Queen Anne herself died, likely of tuberculosis. The king was now utterly alone, a man stripped of his wife and his only child. His enemies immediately weaponized his grief, spreading the vile rumor that he had poisoned his wife in order to marry his own niece, Elizabeth of York, the daughter of his brother Edward, in a desperate attempt to shore up his claim to the throne. The man was being consumed, not just by political threats, but by a profound and isolating personal sorrow that, according to those who saw him, left him a changed, more reckless man. As Richard grappled with his personal grief and the dynastic crisis, the first cracks in his regime began to widen into chasms, and a new, insidious form of warfare began to take hold. A war of rumor and information. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower was the original sin of his reign, and it now became the inexhaustible fuel for his enemy's propaganda machine. From secret presses in London and across the continent, pamphlets and ballads began to appear, spreading a narrative of pure evil. The stories were vivid and horrific, describing the smothering of the innocent boys, their bodies buried under a staircase. This was the work of a sophisticated and well-funded network of dissent, orchestrated by supporters of Henry Tudor and his formidable mother, Margaret Beaufort. Every misfortune that befell the kingdom, a poor harvest, a bout of plague, was blamed on the usurper king, a sign of God's displeasure. Richard's reputation was systematically and deliberately destroyed. He, a man known for his conventional piety, was painted as a godless monster. The physical deformity of his shoulder, a condition now known as scoliosis, was twisted into a monstrous hunchback, an outward sign of his inner corruption. This campaign was devastatingly effective. It eroded his support among the wavering nobility, who began to see him as a liability, a king whose reign was cursed. More importantly, it provided Henry Tudor with the perfect casus belli. He was no longer just a rival claimant seeking power. He was a righteous avenger, a St. George coming to slay the dragon and rescue England from the clutches of a child-murdering tyrant. The rumor mill became a more potent weapon than any army, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and instability that made an invasion not only possible, but inevitable. Richard was trapped, fighting not just against men with swords, but against whispers on the wind, a battle he could not possibly win. The culmination of these pressures, the external threat of Tudor, the internal betrayals, the psychological toll of grief, and the poison of propaganda, led Richard to his final, fateful act. In August of 1485, Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven in Wales with a small, motley army of French mercenaries and English exiles. The invasion had begun. Richard, a vastly experienced and respected military commander, quickly assembled a much larger royal army to crush the rebellion. The two forces met near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. Here, we must analyze the psychology of Richard's fatal error. On the morning of the battle, He saw that the loyalty of some of his key commanders, notably Lord Stanley and his brother, was wavering. The Stanleys, with their large private army, stood on a nearby hill, refusing to commit to either side. Richard knew that a long, drawn-out battle would give them time to betray him. He was a king on borrowed time, his authority bleeding away with every passing minute. In that moment, driven by a mixture of desperation, a warrior's instinct, and perhaps the reckless abandon of a man who had lost everything he held dear, he made an electrifying decision. He saw Henry Tudor's banner across the field, protected by only a small contingent of bodyguards. He would not wait for treachery to unfold. He would end the war himself, right now, with one single decisive act of personal valor. He would lead a cavalry charge directly at his rival. It was an incredibly bold, almost suicidal gamble, the classic maneuver of a medieval warrior king, staking everything on a single charge. It was a decision born of the core of his character, his belief in his own martial prowess and his conviction that a king should lead from the front. He put on his helmet, lowered his lance, and spurred his horse forward, his household knights thundering behind him, straight into the heart of the enemy, a silver boar charging towards a red dragon. The resulting scene was the greatest catastrophe of Richard's life, the final bloody resolution of the Wars of the Roses. The sensory assault of the Battle of Bosworth Field was one of pure medieval horror. The ground, softened by summer rain, churned into a muddy quagmire, the air thick with the screams of men and horses, the percussive clash of steel on steel, and the guttural roar of cannons. Richard's charge was initially a stunning success. It was a flash of lightning, a steel avalanche that smashed through Henry Tudor's surprised bodyguards. The chroniclers report that Richard himself, fighting with the fury of a cornered lion, cut down Henry's standard-bearer, Sir William Brandon, with a single blow. He was within a sword's length of Henry Tudor himself, on the verge of a victory that would have changed the course of English history. The fate of the kingdom hung balanced on the point of a sword for a few heart-stopping seconds. Then, the trap sprung. Sir William Stanley, who had waited on the sidelines, finally showed his hand. Seeing Richard isolated and vulnerable, he led his massive force of knights not to the king's aid, but crashing into his flank. It was the ultimate betrayal. Suddenly, the heroic charge became a desperate last stand. Richard's horse was killed from under him, mired in the boggy ground. He was unhorsed but not defeated, roaring the legendary words, "Treason! Treason!" He refused to flee, fighting on foot, his crown having fallen into a hawthorn bush. The king was surrounded, a lone figure against a sea of enemies. Blows rained down upon him from all sides. A halberd cleaved through his helmet, shattering his skull. The last Plantagenet king died as he had lived, fighting. The chaos of the battlefield gave way to a stunned silence, then to shouts of "God save King Henry." The battle was over. The dynasty was finished. Richard's gamble, the ultimate expression of his warrior ethos, had failed in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The collapse was immediate and absolute. With Richard's death, the morale of the royal army evaporated. The battle turned into a rout. The victorious soldiers of the new king, Henry VII, fell upon the body of the vanquished one with a savagery reserved for a hated tyrant. This was the moment of political and personal collapse. Shakespeare's famous line, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," though fictional, perfectly captures the desperate, ignominious end of a king reduced to a common foot soldier. The aftermath was a calculated ritual of humiliation designed to erase his very memory. His body was stripped naked, slung ignominiously over the back of a horse like a slaughtered animal, and paraded through the streets of Leicester, where it was subjected to the jeers and abuse of the populace. There was no royal funeral, no solemn procession, no tomb in Westminster Abbey. He was buried hastily, without a coffin, in an unmarked grave in the church of the Greyfriars Monastery. This was the ultimate act of Tudor propaganda, to deny him not only his life and his crown, but his dignity in death, to ensure that he had no shrine, no place of pilgrimage for any remaining loyalists. The Tudor era began as the Plantagenet era ended, with the bloody corpse of a king. The crown, found in the hawthorn bush, was placed on Henry Tudor's head right there on the battlefield. A new dynasty had been founded, and its first and most urgent task was to legitimize its violent birth. This required ensuring that the king they had just killed was remembered not as a brave warrior who was betrayed, but as a monstrous fiend whose death was a divine deliverance for the entire kingdom. The collapse of Richard's army on the field was followed by the systematic demolition of his reputation, a process that would begin almost immediately. The true finale of Richard's story was not his brutal death at Bosworth, but the slow, methodical birth of his monstrous legend in the years that followed. To understand his vindication, we must first witness the cinematic scene of his character's assassination. The setting is not a battlefield, but the quiet, scholarly courts of the new Tudor king, Henry VII. Here, under the direct patronage of the new regime, a group of talented writers and historians get to work. The first and most important is an Italian scholar named Polydore Vergil, commissioned by the king to write the official history of England. Vergil, a master of humanist prose, takes the scattered rumors and wartime propaganda against Richard and weaves them into a coherent, compelling, and utterly damning narrative. He is the one who solidifies the story of the hunchbacked tyrant, the evil uncle, the murderer of innocents. A few years later, Sir Thomas More, a brilliant lawyer and statesman, writes his History of King Richard III, a literary masterpiece that reads more like a psychological thriller than a history. More creates a charismatic, intelligent, and utterly malevolent Richard, a Machiavellian villain for the ages. Finally, the ultimate blow comes from the quill of the greatest writer in the English language, William Shakespeare. His play, Richard III, written a century later but drawing heavily on More and Vergil, transforms a historical figure into a timeless archetype of evil. The sensory experience is now one of ink on parchment, of actors on a stage, of words that have more power to kill than any sword. Shakespeare's Richard is a mesmerizing, self-aware monster who declares, "I am determined to prove a villain." This is not history. It is magnificent theater. A work of genius that cemented the image of the evil King Richard so deeply into the cultural consciousness that for the next 400 years, it was accepted not as a dramatic interpretation, but as gospel truth. Richard's legacy, therefore, is not a single story, but a profound conflict of interpretations, a war of narratives that has raged for over 500 years. On one side stands the colossal weight of the Tudor tradition, the story crafted by Vergil, More, and Shakespeare. In this version, Richard is an unambiguous villain, a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power. This interpretation dominated the historical landscape for centuries, taught in schools and universities as established fact. It presented a neat, morally clear universe where a usurping monster was justly struck down by a heroic savior, Henry Tudor, who rescued England from tyranny and united the houses of York and Lancaster. This was the official, state-sanctioned history. But on the other side, a quieter, more persistent counter-narrative has always existed. This is the perspective of the Ricardians, a movement that began as early as the 17th century. They point to the sources that predate the Tudor smear campaign. They highlight the records from the city of York, which, upon hearing of Richard's death, wrote in their official council minutes that he had been piteously slain and murdered, to the great heaviness of this city. They focus on his just laws, his reputation in the north, and the complete lack of any contemporary evidence connecting him to the murder of the princes. For them, Richard is a tragic hero, a good man slandered by his enemies, a capable ruler whose potential was cut short by betrayal. This conflict of interpretations reveals how different cultures and eras have viewed him. For the Tudors, he was the necessary monster. For the city of York, he was their good lord. For modern revisionists, he is the ultimate historical underdog, the victim of a grave injustice. His legacy is a battleground, a perfect case study in how the same set of historical events can be framed to create two completely opposite characters. And so we arrive at the final, comprehensive answer to the core question. Why was England's most hated king vindicated after 500 years? The paradox is solved not by the discovery of a dusty manuscript definitively proving his innocence in the murder of the princes. No such document has ever been found. Instead, Richard III was vindicated because our modern age, with its healthy skepticism of official narratives and its understanding of media and propaganda, was finally able to see the story not just from the perspective of the victors, but from the perspective of the machine that created them. The vindication lies in the recognition that the character of Richard III was a deliberate political construct, arguably the most successful and enduring work of propaganda in Western history. The Tudor dynasty, founded on the battlefield, had a dangerously weak claim to the throne. To survive, Henry VII needed to not only be the new king, but the rightful king, a savior, not a usurper. The easiest way to achieve this was to make the man he overthrew not just a political rival, but a monster of unimaginable evil. Richard's alleged crimes, especially the murder of the innocent princes, served as the perfect retroactive justification for his overthrow and death. It transformed an act of raw ambition, the seizure of a crown, into a moral crusade. What broke Richard was not, in the end, the Stanley betrayal at Bosworth, or even the loss of his son. What truly destroyed him and his reputation for centuries was the power of a well-told story. He was defeated by the narrative. The modern vindication, therefore, is not about absolving him of all wrongdoing. His seizure of the throne was ruthless and illegal, but about recognizing the profound difference between the historical man, in all his complexity, and the cartoon villain created to serve a political purpose. The universal lesson of Richard's life, the verdict of history, transcends the fate of one medieval king. It is a chilling and timeless warning about the nature of power and truth. His story demonstrates with brutal clarity that history is not a passive record of the past, but an active, ongoing battle of narratives. It is not merely written by the victors. It is forged by them, weaponized, and used to legitimize the present. Richard's saga is the ultimate testament to the fact that a lie, if it is bold enough, repeated often enough, and backed by the authority of the state, can become the truth for centuries. He stands as a monument to the power of political assassination, a process that aims to kill not just the body of an opponent, but their very character, their memory, their place in history. His life is a stark illustration of the clash between reputation and reality, and how easily the former can obliterate the latter. The struggle over his legacy teaches us to be critical of every official story, to question every perfect hero and every flawless villain, and to remember that behind every great historical narrative lies a motive. The tale of Richard III is, in the end, a profound meditation on the fragility of truth and the immense, terrifying power of the written word to shape the world, to make kings into monsters and usurpers into saviors long after the blood has dried and the bones have turned to dust. We end where we began. The final frame is not of a king in his crown, nor a villain on a stage, but of a skeleton under the gray skies of Leicester. The bones, now cleaned and housed in a sterile laboratory, have told their own silent story. The curved spine confirms the scoliosis, the physical abnormality that was twisted into a moral deformity. The skull shows the brutal, fatal wounds of Bosworth, the material evidence of his violent end. But these bones do not speak of good or evil. They do not confess to murder, nor do they protest their innocence. They are simply the last, tangible remnants of a man who lived and died in a brutal age. The delicious kebab, the philosophical aftertaste that lingers, is the image of this skeleton, this question mark made of calcium and bone. After 500 years of propaganda, of lies, of literary genius, and of passionate debate, we have found the man's body, but his true character remains as elusive as ever. The king under the car park has been given a new tomb, a place of honor. But his real grave, the deep pit of infamy dug by his enemies, may be one from which he can never fully escape. His bones pose a final, silent question, not just to the historians, but to all of us. In the great sweep of history, how many other monsters were men, and how many other men were made into monsters? 158.3